The goal is to have an endless war, not a successful war. Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is a brutal 3-hour epic about one man's journey towards redemption and reconciliation, not only with his family but with himself. Now, so much has already been said about this film, so these are just a few of my thoughts on its themes and messages it explores. It has been a very long time since I watched a film that has so completely immersed me in a filmmaker's worldview. It presents a vision of humanity in which brutality and violence are integral to life, yet do not represent the entirety of what people are capable of. Despite the violence surrounding these characters, they still seek home, family, honor, and connection. Odysseus may be a warrior and a killer, but he's also a husband, father, leader, someone desperately searching for belonging. We are introduced to Odysseus lost and held captive on a distant island, desperately struggling to remember his own story. Odysseus leaves home in stark contrast to the way he arrived. He sets out with only a small band of soldiers who have survived the war, barely possessing the strength or spirit to make it home. Despite the spoils they have already won, Odysseus and his men cannot really control themselves, and they start to loot and pillage every society they come across. Even before Poseidon curses him, there are already signs that the war Odysseus has won has ultimately been a failure. Rather than deter war, he has actually inspired it, and the story of the horse, at the start of the film at least, is not so much a cautionary tale, but a motivational one. The story of the Trojan horse is very familiar to everyone, yet we're rarely shown what actually happened inside of it. It's always told from the same point of view. However, rather than celebrating this as a victory, the film ends with the horse consumed by flames within Troy, transforming a symbol of triumph into one of suffering, violence, and loss. Now, Odysseus is extremely famous. However, he is now famous for all the wrong reasons. He was regarded as Agamemnon's most brilliant tactician, a reputation that should have earned him fame and admiration throughout the world. Instead, he is now shunned, feared, and treated as a threat. I mean, back home, they are all praying that he is dead. And this great triumph has actually become his greatest shame. And the world sees him less as a heroic individual than as a symbol of violence and destruction. And this perception is reinforced by the film's constant references to the sea people. One of the most striking moments comes when Odysseus realizes that he is part of the sea people the world has come to fear in the aftermath of Troy. Although Odysseus technically won the war, it was hardly a victory. The world is way more unstable than he could have ever imagined. Nothing feels predictable. Part of the tragedy of Odysseus is that his greatest achievement, winning the Trojan War, has reduced him to the very thing the world fears. Odysseus and his men may have declared victory, but not peace. The threat of another war and the expectation that it could erupt at any moment hangs over everything. Everyone lives in anticipation of this new evil, but because they can't actually identify it, they simply call it the sea people. And because no one really knows what this threat is, when it will show up, how it will show up, they live in fear of every stranger who crosses their path. This fear of the sea people in some ways has surpassed even their fear of the gods. At the heart of Nolan's film is the idea that the Trojan horse violated Zeus's law, the idea of treating others as you would want to be treated, and unleashed chaos upon the world. A world in which civility is no longer a necessity but a luxury. By invoking the gods to disguise the Trojan horse as a false peace offering, Odysseus and his men gave way to a brand new world, one where strangers are met with hostility and trust has become a liability. Although Troy was destined to fall, the manner of its destruction marked the end of an old way of life and ushered in a new, more dangerous world shaped by violence, uncertainty, and fear. Worse, it signaled the emergence of a world in which humanity forgets its limits, disregards morality, and abandons the bonds of fellowship with one another. People have really forgotten that they need one another to survive. The central question at the heart of the film is simple. Why doesn't Odysseus want to go home? The Trojan horse was a brilliant tactical achievement, but creating it required Odysseus to violate the very principles he had spent his life defending. His shame does not come solely from the judgment of the gods, but from a deeper conflict within himself, the realization that he has become someone different from the man he believed himself to be. Now, the gods are immortal, men unfortunately are not. While the gods remain untouched by time and suffering, mortals bear the full weight of the war's devastation. After fighting for so many years, Odysseus survives physically, yet the conflict exacts a terrible psychological toll. He experiences an exhaustion of the self and near annihilation of his individual identity as years of violence strips away the person he once was. And the film continually explores the tension between human responsibility and divine influence. While individuals, of course, bear the consequences of their own choices, the gods serve almost as a personification of the mysterious forces that shape human destiny. Through their often violent interventions, they govern the rise and fall of nations, yet they also embody the possibility of justice, hope, and renewal. A central part of Odysseus' journey is learning to discover meaning amid overwhelming loss and destruction, to find what can still be gained from suffering rather than allowing waste and grief to have the final word. Because of the war, he begins to question whether the home he left behind is still the same place he once longed for, and whether he is still someone who belongs there or even deserves to return. Nolan presents a post-Troy world where peace is never truly possible, and where the greatest measure of a successful war is simply having the power to wage another. The only thing keeping Odysseus' kingdom intact is his wife Penelope. Because she refuses to marry another man, no one has been able to seize power and wreak havoc, and therefore these characters are stuck in limbo. The fall of Troy is constantly referenced in the film, and it has become something the characters are trapped within. The way the story of the Trojan horse is often told suggests that history itself begins with war. It is as though humanity knows no other place from which to begin its story, treating conflict not as an interruption of civilization, but as its defining starting point. And at the moment, the story has no end because the uncertainty surrounding Odysseus' death has left everyone in his home suspended and in a state of limbo, endlessly retelling the stories of the past because they're really unable to imagine a future beyond it. They return again and again to old stories because the past is the only world they still understand, revealing how myth can preserve memory while also keeping people imprisoned by it. Now, these suitors you could consider them to be an exception to Zeus's law because they are unwelcome guests and they're very much abusing her hospitality, and they're hoping that enough time will pass that she will eventually be forced to choose one of them. And this complete disregard for Zeus's law is what makes the final massacre so satisfying. There is not a single hero among this crowd. I mean, they are all in different ways cowards whose choices have already sealed their fate. There's really no one to look up to in Ithaca. And it's also important to note that a lot of these suitors have never known war. They constantly question the presence of gods, despite being fully aware of the consequences of violating Zeus's law. However, because these laws offer no immediate benefit to their own lives, they feel little incentive to actually uphold them. Zeus's law is important, especially in a world without any kind of central authority, because it's what makes travel possible in a world of piracy and war. A man who leaves his homeland must rely on the mercy of strangers, as his survival depends on the treatment he receives from those he encounters. Without this code, no one would ever leave home. And observing hospitality is not a moral obligation, but one of self-interest and self-preservation, as every traveler depends on others to extend the same protection they may require one day. Because these men in Ithaca have only known peace, the suitors move through this town as though power belongs exclusively to them, and they're really unable to imagine a force capable of challenging their control. And the way they even exhibit control is really petty. I mean, they're just a nuisance in this home. And the world that Odysseus comes back to, I mean, there are no safe spaces. Nothing is sacred anymore. And this violation of Zeus's law extends far beyond Penelope's home. Temples are desecrated and transformed into instruments of deception and violence. And this is why his return home becomes more dangerous than anything he faced in Troy or across the seas. Odysseus is entering a world he no longer recognizes, where the rules that once governed society have collapsed, and nothing can be taken for granted. As a veteran of the Trojan War, Odysseus has witnessed firsthand the power of the gods and the fragility between the mortal and divine world, something that is clearly lost to all these suitors. And part of the film's commentary is the greater a man's distance from the gods, the easier it becomes for them to break the rules without fearing any consequences. The suitors insult beggars, mistreat anyone they perceive as beneath them, revealing a complete disregard for the values of compassion and hospitality. I mean, they're almost inviting this massacre. And I felt like the ending was so satisfying because these suitors are met with the same indifference they have shown others. There is absolutely no reason for Odysseus to show any of these men mercy. He had already shown restraint and spared lives when he left for Troy, believing that his mercy would be honored upon his return, only to discover that his absence has been met with disrespect and corruption. To reclaim his throne, Odysseus must first disguise himself and devise a plan to kill the suitors, demonstrating a level of cunning and calculated destruction that makes him both a celebrated hero and a man to be feared. The duality of Odysseus' character is what makes him such a compelling figure. He represents both the greatest virtues and the darkest consequences of war, the courage, intelligence, and resilience it creates, as well as the violence, pride, and destruction it leaves behind. Odysseus' long journey home is the result of both his own actions and Poseidon's punishment for blinding his son. Now, there are exceptions to Zeus's law, and Odysseus is a great example of that. By angering Poseidon, he has become a man that no one can really safely welcome, because anyone who offers him shelter risks provoking the god's wrath. He's either chased out or kept for too long, both of which violate Zeus's law. Yet because Poseidon has delayed his homecoming, condemning him to suffer each obstacle becomes more than just a setback, and his voyage is transformed into a test of endurance, resilience, and character, forcing Odysseus to prove not only his cunning, but also his capacity to endure suffering without losing his humanity. And I think Odysseus' journey is such a powerful example of the constant struggle between fate and free will. The gods influence how events happen, while fate determines what must ultimately happen. And Odysseus is pretty much stuck in this back and forth between men and gods, this space where he can unwillingly help fulfill his destiny or fight like hell to try and change it. The gods establish the larger rules and boundaries of the world, while human beings create the conditions in which those rules play out through their choices, conflicts, and actions. Odysseus' decision to blind the Cyclops unleashes a hell on his crew he never imagined possible. And Odysseus' pain is undoubtedly shaped by the actions of the gods, but as the movie goes on, an increasing portion of his suffering becomes the consequences of his own actions. And the same pride and ego that helped Odysseus survive the Trojan War ultimately becomes his greatest weakness, driving him to blind the Cyclops and bring about the deaths of his men. And the way that his men die, I mean, it's truly a horror movie. Whether torn apart by cannibals, lost at sea, or die of starvation. And everyone reaches a point in their journey where death begins to seem more inviting than life. Sadly, what awaits them is not some glorious paradise or even peace, but the house of the dead. And this whole scene was really terrifying because this is where Odysseus is forced to confront his failures and also really accept the suffering that still awaits him. His journey just gets worse and worse and worse. Now, in the film, Odysseus suffers from severe PTSD, haunted by the men and civilians he killed. His determination to hold on to his remaining crew comes from a desperate desire to save them, perhaps as a way of redeeming himself for those he could not protect. A central theme of the film is the overwhelming power of war and ambition, and how these forces can strip people of humanity, transforming individuals into symbols rather than fully realized human beings. One of Odysseus' biggest shames is not burying his men with honor, and this failure strips his men of their identities and reduces them to mere objects, soldiers whose deaths have become forgotten, and almost just as a consequence of war. And I think part of what makes Odysseus' journey so interesting is the way the story of the Trojan horse has come to symbolize a particular kind of power, the ability to challenge established rules and reshape the world through deception and violence. And thankfully, this is a power Telemachus does not inherit. While Odysseus embraces deception as a means of reclaiming what was lost, His son is paralyzed by the weight of his father's legacy. He refuses to seize power through manipulation, and instead waits for a path that restores order without abandoning the values he hopes to uphold. And even in his most desperate moments, Telemachus finds a way to honor the dead, while his father convinces himself that there's never enough time. And this contrast reveals a very stark difference between father and son. Telemachus preserves humanity in the midst of crisis, while Odysseus sacrifices it in the pursuit of survival. And I think the importance this film places on Zeus's law serves as a reminder of what war threatens to destroy. In a world without a central authority capable of enforcing law and order, Zeus's law becomes a universally recognized moral code that binds individuals and societies together. Without it, people risk becoming numb to suffering and losing the ability to see each other as fully human. When these bonds collapse, so does the ability to recognize one another's humanity, and violence becomes the only language left, transforming people from individuals with lives and histories into symbols of war and destruction. And I think the film does a good job of using the Trojan War as a force that exposes the problem. And Zeus's law represents the broader structures that prevent humans from becoming purely violent and self-interested, and pushes back against dehumanization. Now, the ending of the film is far more ambiguous than the poem, because I really want to believe that he sailed off into the sunset, but I feel like there's just no way that was possible, especially with all those arrows inside of him. The final shot of the film of the Trojan horse, combined with Odysseus's words about how their struggles will be forgotten, reframes his entire journey. The very act that made him a legend may also be the thing that reduces him and his men to nothing more than a story. And there's a lot to say about this film. It's certainly not a substitute for reading the poem. However, these are my thoughts. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.